Okay, today is part 3 about shechita and meat-related things, and today's topic is going to be poultry. So I'm going to start with 9 ways that shechita-related things for meat, for poultry, for oifos, is different than animals. And the first 5 are halachic type, and the first, and I'll go through them. And they are: the first is the isser of chaylev, which is certain fats you're not allowed to eat, only applies to behemoths. It does not apply to birds and to chayas. And the terms behemoth and chaya are loosely translated as domesticated and non-domesticated animals. That's just a loose translation. The only animals we really know that are considered behemoths are cows, sheep, and goats. And the only one we're sure is a chaya is a deer. Zebu, in this perspective, zebu are considered to be cows. And all other kosher animals like bison, or for that matter, giraffe, or other things like that, are treated as a suffix chaya, suffix behemoth. That's American buffalo or European buffalo are treated as sveikas. So we're machmir to take out the chaylev, because as I just mentioned, there's an issue of chaylev on issue chaylev on behemoths, but we also machmir for kisei dam. We're going to talk about in a second. Okay, so birds, as I said, don't have any chaylev that's also about them, and the chutei dam, the blood, the bigger blood vessels that we take out from an animal, basically don't have to be taken out from poultry. So the only nikur type thing that's done in practice for birds is the wing tips are cut off because it helps the blood drain out better. Okay, number 2, lechatchila, when a person does shechita, they should check both simanim, the kana, that's the trachea, and the vesha, the esophagus. But the ikar din is that for birds, you only have to cut roiv of one siman, and for the behemoths and the chayas, you're supposed to cut roiv of both siman. Okay, number 3, after you do the shechita of a chaya or a bird, you have to do the mitzvah kisei adam. There's no such mitzvah for behemoths. The mitzvah kisei adam, you don't have to cover all the blood; you just have to cover some of it. There has to be dirt underneath it and dirt on top of it. And when I say the word dirt, it doesn't have to truly be dirt. It could be anything, anything in which something can something that things can grow in, or something that the Torah calls offer. And in practice, most commercial shchitas use sawdust. That's the most common thing to use. It has to be sort of loose and powdery, looking like sawdust is, and it can't be in clumps. Okay, number 4, we only eat birds for which there's a Messiah that they're kosher. So for us, that means is the common chickens that we use for egg laying, the white leghorns and the Rhode Island Reds, and the ones that are used as broilers. we consider to have a Messiah on. We consider ourselves to have a Messiah on turkey. Certain ducks, mallard, pekin, and Indian runner, and certain geese, the white Emden and the gray Toulouse. I don't know if I pronounced that right. And a certain kind of quail, the European quail, the Caturnix, a very specific kind of quail. And those are the birds that we know we have a Messiah for. Those are allowed. We can only eat birds if they have a Messiah. In the United States, most places can follow the assumption that for behemoths and chayas, there's no need to have a Messiah. You need to have a Messiah if you want to know if it's a behemoth or a chaya. That we do, but not whether it actually is a kosher animal or not. And you just have to have the regular simanim, split hooves and chewing their cud, and then you can know the animal's kosher. The last, which is not so negay to us, is that in Eretz Yisrael there's a mitzvah to give Yisrael chayim keva from behemoths, from cows, sheep, and goats, actually, to a kohen. That mitzvah doesn't apply to oifos and chayas at all. Doesn't apply to us, really, because we don't deal with it. We don't have to do that in chutz. We paskin that we don't have to do that. The minhag is that we don't have to do that in chutz aretz. Okay, those were 5 halachic type differences between oifos and other animals. And there's also, I have here 4 practical differences between the way they're shechted and processed. The first is that there's a general rule that if a chalaf has a begim, if you after shechita you check the chalaf and you find out that it has a begim in it, some kind of a nick or bump in it, then any shechitas that you've done since the last time you checked that chalaf, and then it was clean and it was good, are puzzle. So the animals, everything you shechted until since the last time is considered to be treif or nevela. So because of that, every time you shecht an animal, when they finish the shechita, they check the chalav to make sure that the animal was really kosher. Okay, sometimes with dakas, they check only every few animals, but they check basically after every animal to make because if it has a begima in it, then the animal that you just shecht is going to be treif. So you don't want to do that after many animals. You do it after every single one to make sure the animal is kosher. But when birds are shechted commercially, then they will check it only every 5-10 minutes. Forget about every 5-10 birds. I mean, dozens of birds have had shechita before they get checked again. And there's two reasons for that. One is that it's pretty uncommon that shechita of a bird will lead to a pegima. It's a simpler shechita. There's less chances of getting pegima. And second is that it's worth it for a commercial shechita that they should once in a while, maybe once a day, have to throw out 100 birds rather than and consider them treif, rather than stopping after every single shechita to check the chalav. It takes time to check the chalav. Shechita of birds is really fast. They go to many of them every minute. So it's a financial decision that if once in a while it's going to happen, they're going to have to throw out 5 or 10 minutes worth of shechita. That's worth it rather than stopping between each one. Okay, so that's one difference. Another is typically birds have feathers on their neck and they have to be removed before shechita. Sheep also have hair on their neck. Now they actually breed some chickens specifically to not have neck feathers because they don't want to have to deal with this. That's actually specially bred for kosher. But for cattle, you don't have to shave the neck. There's no such thing. There's no shaving to do. But lamaisa, they do clean it. They don't shave it. They clean it, and they comb it and power wash it. All of that is to prevent pegimas with the knife. When the knife is going to pass through, if there's something there, that'll cause a pegima in the knife, which will make the animal unavailable. Okay. Another one is that when you shecht an animal, you need to restrain it. So for an animal, like for a behemoth or a chaya, typically that's in a pen or some other device that holds the animal still to prevent a drusa. But for birds, that you don't need something so serious. And typically the shaychet does it himself. He'll hold the bird himself. He go tfisa, which has to do where you hold the neck. I mean, you do a tfisa in a behemoth also, but he's literally holding the whole bird himself. Sometimes in a commercial facility, that'll be done with somebody else. Someone not even necessarily Jewish, who's holding the legs and the wings, and then the shaychet just grabs the head and the neck to do the shechita. And our last difference is that when you're doing melicha for a bird, then you have to pay attention to take out the internal organs like the kidneys. Okay, so the salt can get all the place it has to get to. You have to also make sure that the salt gets on the inside of the cavity. Think of a whole chicken or a whole turkey. The inside, you have to make sure you get salt on the inside. And also, when you do melicha, you have to make sure the bird is sitting in a way that the blood can drain out and it doesn't pool up in a inside, like in this cavity on the inside of the bird. Okay, all those things are not relevant to animals. I mean, you have to take the kidneys out of an animal, but you're obviously obvious those are going to come out before you do melicha. As opposed to in a bird, it's possible to miss these kind of things. Okay, so these were 9 differences, some halachic and some like practical, between how shechita and similar things are done for birds as to other things. Okay, now the next thing to talk about is Teraifos. So the rule is that anything that would make an animal a treifa would make a bird a treifa also. It's the same thing. Excuse me. Halachas of treifas are in theory they're the same, but in practice, the things that are common in animals are basically non-existent in poultry. We don't check lungs for sirchas in birds. There's no such thing. Their lungs don't look anything like the lungs of a cow. But there are things that we check for in birds that we don't check for in cows either. Not to say that one wouldn't be a treifa in the other one if it was there, but in practice it's not really an issue. So the things we check for in birds are very different from what's checked in animals. Okay, so I'm going to go through the things that are checked in. Okay, and the first one is actually something that's not at the slaughterhouse, and that is that birds are given injections, like little kids are, give injections to make sure they don't get certain diseases. And it used to be they gave those injections into birds that were just a day old or a couple of days old. And some places still do that. Some countries actually still do that. Okay, but nowadays it's much more common that at least in the United States, that the injection is done into the egg before it hatches. And both of these raise issue, whichever way you do it, into the bird or into the egg, raise issue into the egg. It's called in ovo. Both of those methods have an issue that it might puncture the lungs or the intestines or some other organ that would make the bird into a treifa. Okay, so one part of that shaila has to do with tshuvas in Chassam Sofer about what happens if the person who's doing this poking is someone who has a skill and he knows exactly how to do it without hitting a place that would make the animal into a treifa. So in which case do we trust the person to say that he did not hit anything that there's a problem? So that's a big part of the shailos have to do with how much can we trust somebody. And so many poskim are meckel on that and say, listen, if the person knows what he's doing, the person is a professional, you can be sure we can be sure that he did not hit the veshed or something else that would make the animal into a treifa. Others say that no, we need to have a mashgiach tamidi. We need to put the injections into, when we do it in live birds, we need to do it into a very specific spot. They do it in some of those people will do dafka in the thighs, is because there can't be any way to make it a treifa in that way. So there's different approaches when it's done into actual live birds. Now in ovo, doing it into the egg has a big advantage because it's done by a machine, which is computer controlled, very well calibrated, and there's no judgment over here. It does really well and again and again. However, the downside is that when they study the injections being given into the egg, they find that as the egg gets older and older, as eggs they sit for, as it gets closer and closer to when it's going to hatch, there's a higher chance of it hitting the chick or the embryo for the simple reason that it's getting bigger and bigger. So the bird that's growing inside, it's going inside the egg, is getting bigger and bigger and closer to where you're going to put the injection in. So, for example, when they gave the injection at 18 days, at exactly 18 days, there was a 4% chance of hitting the embryo. At 18 and a half days, it was a 15% chance. And at 19 days, it was like a 30% chance. So it was going up dramatically. That's around when they want to give the injection, and it's going up dramatically. Now, from our perspective, we and the people giving the injections have the same plans, but with the same understanding, and we have opposite conclusions. Which is to say, for them, hitting the embryo is good. Make it more likely that the injection will be that the animal will be inoculated. So they want to hatch. They want to give the injection as late as possible. We want to give the injection as early as possible because we want to not hit the bird. They want to hit the bird, and we definitely don't want to hit the bird. Okay, so it's sort of like a tug of war over here. So the some people made halachic suggestions why it's not relevant if we hit the birds when they're inside, because maybe it does make a difference if it becomes a treifa. All kinds of things related to that. Shailos about what there's actually quite a lot of halachic issues as to whether the animal would be a treifa and whether it would stay a treifa, etc., if it was hit before it was born at all. But the good news is, Reb Chaim Loki of the OU found out that it's true that about 10 to 15% of the embryos get hit with the needle, but the systems that are more advanced, bedafka will not hit the neck. It has to do with the way the birds are positioned and the way the needle comes in. It will not hit the neck. Now, it could hit other parts that could lead to treifas, but the neck, from treifa's perspective, is more serious than other parts. So hopefully, the thought here is that maybe it's so uncommon to make the animal to a treifa that we could ignore that possibility. One last point in this is that there are a lot of hatcheries that were given guidelines by their hashgachah of this is what you have to do in order to do the injections. What the hashgachah wants them to do, like to do it only on a certain day at a certain time, and it's worthwhile that the hashgachah should actually follow up on that, not just hand them a piece of paper, but actually be on top of that. Okay, let's move on to another type of treifas that is for birds, and that is that there are lots of organs in a bird or an animal, for that matter, that if they get a hole in them, makes the animal into a treifa. It's really hard to imagine anybody noticing a hole in a chicken's, intestines or anything like that, any place that would make it a treifa. But the Rama says anytime that the flesh looks like it's dissolving or rotting or diseased, then we assume that there was a hole in that spot, and that's they're signs of each other, and therefore we have to assume that the animal's a treifa. So because of that, there'll be a baidik in the shchita who will look at a number of the internal organs, the lungs, the heart, the gizzard, the intestines, just a visual look at them. Just look at them and say, does this look regular and normal? Like, for example, a chicken lung that's healthy has this dark red color, and when you squeeze it, it has like a spongy consistency to it. So that means a baidik in some places will do is, as it passes by, he'll just hold on to the lung for a second, just touch it. By looking at it and feeling it, he feels, does this feel like a regular lung, or does it look decayed? Was it like it's missing pieces, or dark, a black color, or something just doesn't look right about it? Then that animal would be considered to be a treifa. Okay, so for all these different parts, they're looking to see not the whole per se, but the damage, the rotting, there's something like that would tell them that this animal something might be a hole there. Okay, another issue of treifas that there is in birds is that just like I mentioned beforehand about discolorations and things like that, one of them is the intestines. So what happens is like this: when a chick is inside the egg, it gets its nourishment from the yolk sac. The yolk sac which would be eventually a yellow if you have the yellow part of the egg if it wasn't turning into a chicken. Well, that yolk sac is outside of the chicken, but the way it connects to the chicks or the embryo's intestines is through this little connector. It connects to the intestines, and that connector is called the Meckel's Diverticulum. Okay, got a long Latin name, and it's basically right in the center, in the middle of the chicken's intestines. So what happens is, in a typical chicken, when the chicken hatches, it doesn't have to eat for a few days, and it lives off whatever's left in the yolk sac. After it hatches, the yolk sac stays attached to the intestines, which is on the chicken, and then eventually this diverticulum shrivels up, and it remains like this little tiny little thing sticking out of the intestines. And you look at it; it looks like a little bump on the intestines. Again, it's approximately in the middle, and nothing. It doesn't cause a problem. Lamaisa, nowadays, farmers want to fatten up their chickens as soon as they're born, so they start feeding them food right from the beginning, and as a result, sometimes the bird stops in taking in the nutrition from the yolk sac, and sometimes it'll become infected. There are all different kinds of ways that it could look, which are fine. You have to have some experience in this, but the ones, at least that I saw that were problematic, were they ended up looking white, like pussy. And when you slice it open, the slice opens the diverticulum. You see that it's not just something stuck in there, not a piece of food that slid into there, but there's literally you can't, the skin is something's wrong with the skin, and then they consider those to be neguas hadakin, that the intestines have a hole in them, or hashgachah that they have a hole in them, and that will be considered treifa. Okay, another issue of a last issue of treifas, or at least directly to do with treifas, is tzomas hagidin, and that is the muscles in a chicken's leg, in his drumsticks, control the movement of the toes. Okay, how do the muscles connect to the toes? There are these tendons, or chutin, if you want to call them, that pass through the shank. That the shank would be the end of the drumstick, the most narrow part of the drumstick. The Gemara says there are 16 different tendons, and as they go through the shank, they bind together to the tzomas, where they come together. Okay, now if any of these tendons are cut, then the chicken is treifa. And there's two ways you could check for it. You could check for it in the end of the drumstick. That's one way to look for it. At the bottom of the drumstick, where they all come together, they could make a slice of a cut that's like along the length of the drumstick, and look into to see if the tendons are all whole. Or you could check it in the part that's below the drumstick, the part that we don't eat, where the toes are. They could check over there also, do a similar thing, make a slice over there also, and check the tendons over there also, and to see that they're all whole. Now, in Eretz Yisrael, having to do with the way they raise their chickens, it's very common that there's a problem in the tzomas hagidin. Like they say maybe 12, 13, 14, 15% of the chickens will have a problem. So they've been checking this kind of Teraifos forever. I mean, for a long time they checked it. Okay, but in some places they have mashgichim who check as they pass by, because they're so used to how they look, they could tell if there's something, even from the outside, they could tell, if something's wrong with the chicken, it's discolored or swelled in a way that tells them that there's a problem. And other places, they actually cut open the each of the legs to see whether it's Teraifos. Now, in America, until not so long ago, we didn't check for this because it was very rare. It wasn't a common thing. But at some point, they did notice it. There was a problem. It turned out in that case, it had to do with a change in the shots that they were being given. So since then, Hashgachahs have taken different stands on how everyone has started checking. There are different ways of how they check it. In some places, they do a sample of each batch. Before the 10,000 chickens show up at the shechita, they'll take out a few hundred of them and check them to see if they're okay. And then, after they'll check them and then they'll check them. And others they check every single chicken. Different ways of checking for this tzomas hagidim problem here in the United States. Okay, now let's move to another thing, something called Foie Gras, and that is for hundreds of years, there's been a big to-do about something called gestufte gens, which means stuffed geese, which is they take geese and they force feed them for a few weeks, and the goose becomes really fatty. And people used to do this because they wanted the fat. They wanted the fat, that the schmaltz from these geese for cooking. Okay, that's what people used to do with it, and I'm going to tell you in a second what the shailos are. But people used to do that, and it was a to-do whether that was mutter or not. Nowadays, they actually aren't doing it for the fat. It's not common that people are cooking with that fat, but they do it because they want the liver, the fatty liver that comes from this. It has an off-white color, and it's called foie gras, which is a French word for fat liver, and it's considered a delicacy. And there's 4 issues to think about, and I'm going to just mention them briefly. Well, first is that it used to be that that foie gras, well, this kind of thing was made from stuffed geese, as I've been mentioning, gestufte gens. But in recent years, people have started using doing it with ducks instead of with geese. Okay, it has a little bit of a different name. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we only have a Masorah on certain ducks, not all of them. And in fact, some people like to do with a mular duck, which we do not consider which we do not consider to have a Masorah on. So that's one thing that's not has nothing to do with the stuffing, but it has to do with the type of duck that they're choosing to use. Okay, the second is that it used to be that the way they did this, the way they force fed the birds, was they took a metal tube and stuck it down their throat, and then just poured grain or some other starch down this tube, basically bypassing their mouth. They just forced it into their stomachs, or whatever they have like that's like a stomach. It looked really awful and painful to birds, and made a lot of people concerned about tzar b'lechaim. Okay, so now there are people who say that the modern methods of doing this are not painful at all to the birds, and the birds love it, and they're happy, and they come back for more and more, and they don't have any problems with it. And it could be that would solve the technical issue of tzar b'lechaim. L'maisa, it doesn't get away from the perception of the tzar b'lechaim, because in the world, people look at foie gras as something that's painful to animals. Many countries have even banned it completely, so it looks bad. So what we have to think about is, even if the technical issue of tzar b'lechaim is taken care of, you have to think about whether the perception of tzar b'lechaim is still there. It might make rabbis look like they're doing the wrong thing, even for giving hashgachah on it. Okay, now the third issue, which is the main issue that the person spoke about, is whether sticking something down the bird's neck causes a problem of the kuvas haveshet. It doesn't make a hole in the esophagus by doing that. Okay, so now I'll mention some of the parts to that shaila. Well, one is simple. If you keep poking, sticking something down the bird's veshet for weeks and weeks, or a few weeks at a time, are you going to make a hole? That's the simplest question. Another is, what happens? The Rambam talks about maybe you should check the veshet after you shecht it to see if it has any holes in it. Well, but what about the fact that we have another rule, the Rambam says elsewhere, that we consider ourselves not bikiyim to check a veshet for holes. So which one is it? Do we check or do we not check? And what happens then? Also, we're going to check the veshet after the shchita. Well, shchita means you cut. Usually, you cut the veshet also. So maybe you cut it in the place where there was a hole. Well, what about the possibility that what happened? What about the possibility that the hole that they made on the first day when they were force feeding the animal has already healed by now? So when you look at it now, you won't see any hole, but it really had a hole, and once it has the hole and makes it into a treifa, it can't become mutter afterwards. And also, for that matter, how on earth would you check it? What's the way to check it? So there's always been these kind of questions have been very serious shailos. Certain poskim say that you shouldn't use it at all. You shouldn't eat these gestapte gens at all. Others, including the Ramo, were more Meckel about it. So this is a long-standing halachic shaila. Okay, now the last issue is somewhat of a more modern issue, and that is, as I mentioned, nowadays the people want these stuffed geese not for the schmaltz of it, but they want it because of they want the livers. Okay, and that has a kashrus question, which is these livers, are white or they're off-white. They're not red like a typical liver that you're used to. So first of all, so the question is, what do you do to kasher them? The color doesn't change very much during kashering when you broil the livers to get the blood out, as they basically stay the same color from beginning to end, as opposed to livers that are regular livers that are red colors. You see the difference in color. And also, when you kasher a regular liver, as you're kashering, there's blood dripping out. You could see the blood just dripping out of the thing. And over here, you don't see anything. You don't see any blood coming out. So how do you know when you're done? How long you've done it for? How do you know that it's there and the blood is all out? But even more fundamental question is that the reason why people want the foie gras is because they want the fattiness of the liver. It's called foie gras. It's a fat liver. That's what they're looking for, the fatness. Well, the problem is if you put this liver over the fire and you broil it, all the fat's going to melt away. So how on earth are you going to kasher this thing to make it to get the blood out and still keep all the fat that's going to be into there? Okay, so there were ideas of doing it without a direct flame, maybe all kinds of things, but those are ideas that we would never do. We would not consider to be acceptable when we're regular kashering meat. So why should it be okay over here? So this at least seems to be the most challenging, serious issue that there is for the foie gras. Anyhow, but based on all these different issues, Rabbi Reese said that we should not do it. We shouldn't allow it in stores that we give hashgachah to, because of all these different issues. Okay, now our last group of things we're going to talk about is shailos that people will get in a packaged chicken, which is to say is things we've talked until now. Most of them have to do with the slaughterhouse and not to do with the private people. But here are some issues that people might see. I'm going to talk about 3 different types of issues that people might see in a packaged chicken that they have in their house. And the first is like this: if an animal gets wounded when it's alive, and there's like a clumps of blood, it's called nitzra hardan, clumps of blood in a place, you have to cut the meat in that place before you do malicha. Okay, you have to cut that spot out so that the blood can drain out. So lots of people will see when they buy chicken that the drumsticks, on the narrow end of the drumsticks, and sometimes you see it in wings also, it's red. Okay, and the red looks like blood. Okay, in the kosher people, I don't know if this is a technical name, the kosher people call these red legs. Okay, because that's what they look like. They look like red legs. Okay, so sometimes it comes from the people in the plant being, the way they deal with the chicken after the shechita. They bang it against the conveyor belt that it has to hang on to, things like that. The question is like this: is this an issue? So one reason why it might not be an issue is because Kenzai, the only issue is when it's nitzra hadam, when there's a clumps of blood, rather than just some discoloration, which is what's more common. Another thing is that it could be only if there's a lot of blood, but just the small amount that we see is also not so much. So basically, what most people will see in their houses is not an issue, and you only have to get it out if it's more pronounced than a bigger amount of blood that's there. The second thing is, the I mentioned before the tzomas hagidin, that if these gidin, if any of them are cut, the animal's a treifa. So the Ramah says that if you see that an animal or bird was wounded in the place of the tzomas hagidin, meaning at the bottom of the drumstick or the part below it, which again we don't eat, but you see it has wounded over there, then you have to be choishish that the gidin got ripped. Let's say the animal was alive, got whacked in the foot by a piece of metal. So you see a wound over there. So you have to say, maybe that also caused the gidin to be ripped. And that's another question people have about the red lips, because it's in the spot of the tzomas hagidin. And the question is whether should we say not because of the blood that we have to get. That was a question of the malicha, but here it's a question of maybe the animal's a treifa. The question is about the tzomas hagidin were cut. And here the Poskim also say that you should not be machmir unless there's a really significant wound. They said don't throw out food just because you see some little amount there. It'll have to be something more serious before you could say the animal's a treifa. Now, I guess it should be obvious, but animals can only become a treifa when they're alive. Once the shechita happened, it's too late. The animals, if he's not a treifa, he's not becoming a treifa. So if the farmer grabbed the chicken with a metal hook to get it back in, to get it where it's supposed to be, where he wants it to go, then we could have a problem with tzomas hagidin. But if we do if the damage happened when the bird was being hung on the hooks or being put into a cone or something like that after the shechita, that's obviously not a problem. So a person with experience could tell the difference by looking at what looks like a wound. He could tell the difference whether are we looking at something that happened when an animal was alive, when the bird was alive, or after it died. And in fact, shchitas have a mashgiach who looks at the birds as they're zipping by, and he picks out the ones that look like they have a problem, like they may have been damaged while they were alive. And the color plays a big role into that. Like light red marks, or those are just on the surface, those are common of things that happen after the bird was shechted. So a little blood was still there and it came out, and that's not a shailos of it breaking tzomas hagidin or something like that. But black and blue marks don't form after the animal's dead. It would only be that tells us that this thing probably happened while the animal was alive, and it was already starting to heal, and so those would be more serious of an issue. Okay, now, one last group of things to say is about broken bones. As I keep saying, if a bone broke after the animal was shechted, it doesn't mean nothing wrong. Can't make a difference to us. But I'm going to mention 4 different ways that a broken bone that would happen while the animal was alive would make it into a treifa, which are something just to bear in mind. And one is like this: a chicken wing has 3 sections. The one that's closest to the body, it's called the humerus. If it breaks within about an inch of the body, so on the part that's closest to the body, within the close, like about an inch or so, then the bird is a treifa because of a chashash that the broken bone, the jagged edge, might have poked inside and punctured the lungs. So that's a very specific kind of a break. Okay, if any of the other wing bones break, the bird is not a treifa, but any meat from that point towards the outside of the bird and right around there is cut off, and we consider it Eivir min hachayim midrabanan. If it happened while the bird was alive, then the broken bone is as if it's midrabanan, as if it was separated from the rest of the bird before the animal died, and therefore midrabanan has to be thrown out. Okay, if the drumstick tibia is broken, then the chicken is considered to be a treifa because of a chashash that maybe the broken bone also broke the tzomas hagidin. And if the upper bone in the chicken leg, the femur, comes out of its socket, it's called buka da'atma tishaf miduchte. That bone that goes into the hip socket came out of its place. The bird is considered to be a treifa. Typically, if that happens when the bird is alive, there's a lot of blood, and it's like a really gory and ugly. And somebody at the slaughterhouse would have taken it out. When that really happens, it's pretty noticeable. And the same chash of bukudatma, usually we assume that for the same also if that upper bone breaks also. Okay, now just one last part about mentioning about issues with packaged chickens is that if a person picks up a package of chicken and in it has a bunch of different parts that are not attached to each other, chances are that those parts were not from the same chicken. Just they're in the same piece of styrofoam, but they're not from necessarily the same chicken. So even if it's determined that a specific piece is a treifo or some other kind of a problem to it, some kind of issue, and you say you have to throw it out, that has nothing to do with the rest of the pieces that are in there. The other pieces are going to be perfectly fine. And you don't have to worry that they became treifos.